The proceeding will start shortly.
Right. Well, can I first of all welcome you, Secretary of State, to what I am sure will be the first of many appearances before the Select Committee. We have a lot of ground to cover this afternoon, so colleagues' succinct questions and Mr Davis' succinct answers would certainly be helpful. And I'm going to kick off. Following last week's debate in the House of Commons and the motion that was passed, the government is now going to publish its plan for the negotiations before Article 50 is triggered. When can we expect to see this?
Well, as soon as we can, Chairman, once all of the research and policy is complete. I mean, the reason for setting the final possible date at the 31st of March was numerous, but one of them was the determination to carry out all of the policy work first, consult properly, and then bring something to Parliament.
So, next month, January, February?
It won't be next month. I mean, the policy work is still underway. There are quite a few decisions still to be made. We've carried out, or we're in the midst of carrying out, about 57, I think, sectoral analyses, each of which has implications for individual parts of 85% of the economy, and some of those are still to be concluded. We have work still to be done on justice and home affairs, so there's a fair number of things still to do. So it will be as soon as we're ready.
Can you confirm that it will be a white paper when it is published?
No, what I will say is we will present the plan. I mean, first thing I have to do, as you will remember from the motion, one of the constrictions in the motion, in the government's amended motion, which got through by 372, I think, majority, was that I should do it in such a way, or the government should do it in such a way that it does not undermine our negotiating position. So we've got to be very careful about what we do publish. I want to be as open as we can be, but we must be sure we're not undermining our own position.
But with respect, that's to do with the content of it.
Yes.
Now, given that for a whole load of treaties, as was raised in the debate, indeed when we applied to join in 67, that's the form that publications of what the government is trying to achieve, taken the form of a white paper on many occasions. I'm just trying to understand why it wouldn't be.
Well, it'll be appropriate to what the content is we're presenting, that's all. We'll decide on the format when we get close to the time, when we know exactly what we're going to present.
Right. Can you confirm that you expect to be sitting opposite Michel Barnier when the negotiations eventually begin, and that you intend them both to cover the divorce arrangements and the new framework for our relationship with the EU?
Yes.
Yeah, that's how that's going to work. Now, the Chancellor said on Monday there is an emerging view amongst business, regulators and thoughtful politicians that it would be generally helpful to have a longer period to manage the adjustment as we leave the European Union. Can we classify you, Secretary of State, as a thoughtful politician when it comes to transitional arrangements?
Well, I'm not sure about the second qualification. I hope you can classify me as a thoughtful politician. In that context, let me be clear about where I think we are going. Firstly, as the Prime Minister said a number of times, I've said a number of times, what we're after is a smooth and orderly exit. That's the overarching aim. And people get frustrated with us sticking to overarching aims, but the point is that's what we're trying to do. That's the purpose of at least a part of the tactic and strategy of this. And within that box, we want to get the maximum market access for British companies with the minimum of disruption. And so we'll do what's necessary to that aim.
What if all of those things can't be negotiated within it could be 18 months, depending on
well, Mr.
what
Barnier
view is
said
taken?
Mr. Barnier said 18 months.
Yes.
And I think that it is all negotiable in that time. I mean, that's the sort of core of this, really. We have got a lot to do, but that's one of the reasons. I mean, you may have thought perhaps my opening answer wasn't that helpful, but it's one of the reasons that we are taking our time to get prepared on all fronts. That's why our 57 studies cover 85% of the economy, everything except sectors that are not affected by international trade. So we are aiming to get ourselves in a position where we can negotiate within the Article 50 process. After all, the Article 50 process was written to allow departure from the European Union. That's its purpose. And plainly, the architects of it, the authors of it, thought that it was time enough to do the job. And so do I.
It's one thing for the government to think, well, we'll be organised and ready to do a deal within 18 months, but that may not necessarily be the case for the 27 countries that you are negotiating with. If it isn't possible to do it within the 18 months, then won't there, of necessity, need to be transitional arrangements?
Well, you've been in politics long enough, Mr. Chairman, to know that's a hypothetical question.
Indeed.
However, I'll do my best to answer it for
Good.
you, even so. Look, a transitional arrangement means many things to different people, and if you think of it as the way I saw it from what the Chancellor said, I think the phrase he used was something like, have been raised within by businessmen, regulators, and as you said, thoughtful politicians. I think the Treasury afterwards added the word European thoughtful politicians to that, but that's by the by. It seems to me what they're talking about probably is some sort of implementation mechanism. However, even whatever the transition arrangement is, we need to know where we're going before we decide on the transition. If you build a bridge, you need to have both sides established before you build the bridge. And so we need to know where we're going. It seems to me that it's perfectly possible to know what the end game will be in 2 years.
So you're not opposed to there being transitional arrangements if they prove ultimately to be necessary?
Well, it depends what you mean by transitional arrangements. Implementation phase of something, if it's necessary, and only if it's necessary, yes. But I think the thing to understand here is that the British people want this done with some degree of expedition. They want it done properly and soon. And that's what we're trying to do.
Now, it was reported, you spoke to the City of London Corporation on the 15th of November, and I think what they describe as their informal record of those discussions have been published, and I don't know whether you've had a chance, A, to read it, and B, to comment on it, but it was indicated at that point that you were not particularly interested in the arrangements, but were reported to have said that if the EU wanted them, then you would be inclined to be kind to them. Do you think that they're more likely to want transitional arrangements?
Two things, Mr. Chair. Two things, Chairman. Firstly, I sometimes burst out laughing when I read what I'm supposed to have said in certain circumstances. Okay. It's a syndrome you'll recognise as well as me, I think. And so I don't never comment on these sorts of gossip. I never comment on that. But I think what the substance of your question was, not the commentary, not the gossip. What was the substance?
It's whether you think. By the way, as I understand it, it was their record of the conversation they had with you, which is rather different from gossip. But anyway, it's whether you think the other 27, whether you think the other 27 might wish.
It doesn't correlate
to
with
have
either the government's position.
No, you've made that very clear.
Yeah.
It's whether the 27 might be interested in transitional arrangements.
Well, they may. I mean, as the Chancellor said, his group of people was businessmen, regulators, and he said thoughtful. I think he meant thoughtful European politicians.
All civil servants.
That may be true. I don't think that's true.
Well, that is true, and I didn't quote that for a reason.
You'll have to protect me from the heckling, Mr. Chairman.
Do you worry about the cliff edge that the Prime Minister acknowledged in answering the question at the CBR?
Well, we've said in terms we want to have a smooth and orderly exit. That's what we want. I think, like all these things, when you go into a negotiation, you try to see where the issues are and you deal with them beforehand. Then you don't have to worry when you get to the end. That's the purpose. We have said to business over and over again, we are trying to get them the maximum opportunity for trade, both within Europe and outside Europe, and the minimum disruption. And that's what we're after.
Does the work that you are currently set in train, does it include a contingency plan in case we end up with no deal, or say the deal were voted down by the European Parliament? Is the government thinking about what it would do in those circumstances if we exited with no deal whatsoever?
I will reiterate to you, Mr. Chairman, that is not our intention. We're aiming for a free access, the maximum free access to all possible markets, but we'll do contingency planning for all the likely outcomes.
All the likely outcomes. That's very helpful. And just finally from me, before I turn to colleagues, on membership of the Customs Union, you told the House last week, you said it, and I quote, this is not a binary option. There are about 4 different possibilities.
Yeah, possibly more.
Yeah. And we are still assessing them. Could you just briefly set out for us what those possibilities are? I'm not asking you to say what the government's conclusion will be, because you haven't reached one yet, but what are the possibilities?
No, there are sort of two ways. I'll give you both ways of looking at it, because they're both informative. Firstly, to look at what actually exists at the moment. You have, obviously, countries inside the customs union, that's clearly one. You have countries like Turkey, which has an arrangement which puts it inside the customs union for some of its economy and outside for others, which allows it to do very limited free trade agreements. You have a circumstance like Norway, which is inside the single market but outside the customs union, and you have countries like Switzerland, who are outside the single market but with bilateral, a large number, about 20-something trade deals, and they are outside the customs union, but they have customs arrangements. The four I had in mind, and as I say, they're not comprehensive, but the sort of four staging, if you like, a spectrum, were between inside the customs union, a partially inside Turkish model, if you like, outside but with a free trade agreement and a customs arrangement, as happens in some parts of the world, and completely outside. That's the sort of spectrum, if you like.
So that, as I understand it, that list doesn't include trying to be in the customs union for certain sectors.
Yeah, well, that's what I said. There are others as well, but they're not on a spectrum. I had, in my mind, a spectrum of four. It's sort of off to the side of the spectrum. Yeah.
Right. And are you looking at all at whether Northern Ireland might remain within the customs union in order to avoid a hard border?
No, that's not one of the options we've been looking at so far, anyway. I mean, what we are determined about, and I'm sure Mr. Durkan will raise it with me at some point, we are determined to maintain that as an open border. But as an example of how that might be done, the committee might look at the Norway-Sweden border, where they're both in the single market, but they straddle the customs union. And it's a very open border with particular arrangements designed to make the border a free border.
Okay, thank you. Maria Caulfield.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just really want to set the scene for the progress in the department itself, because as a committee we went to visit on the 8th of November and met the department there, and we were told at that time, when we asked about how much resources were in place and staffing, that there were about 300, just over 300 people in the team, but that more was forthcoming. So could you update us on the progress of the actual department itself, and what resources you've got and what resources you're still lacking?
We have 300, as the last time I looked was a few days ago, 330 members of the team. And bear in mind, this has grown from about 40 since July. I mean, the basic department didn't exist in June, and it's grown from about 40 in July to 330 now. In addition to that, we have 120 at UCREP who obviously do the representational role in the European Union. But they're also, by definition, experts. They come from all the different departments of Whitehall, and they provide expertise to us as well as a sight of what our European interlocutors' views are. So we have them. There will be more. I don't know what the final number is, because, frankly, what we do, and I think you may have been told this when you were there, is we also have a lot of applications from outside. We have 10 times as many applications from inside the civil service as we could take, 10 applications for every job virtually. So we have very, very high quality staff inside, which I hope you sort of saw when you came. And we basically look at what task has to be done and see what needs to be put in place. The Treasury accepted our budget in full. If we need to go above it, then we'll need to use contingency. But because the department will only exist for about 2.5 years, that's not the same sort of problem as it would be as if you had a permanent department. So we don't foresee problems there. The other issue we've had is just geography, and that is I think it was all still in the Cabinet Office when you visited, Chairman?
Yeah.
Sorry, say that again.
Were all my team still in the Cabinet Office when you visited?
Yeah, I think they were about to move.
They're about to move over the road, that's right. So we've got a floor now for that, which will make the thing easier to manage. But that's it. I mean, we're not constrained and except by time, we've got to get this done quickly, and we're doing this at the same time. We're sort of building the machine while we're actually doing the work, so that of course is an issue for us. But the other thing to bear in mind is the department is a mixture of a coordination, a linking, and a policy department. And we decided right from the beginning that it was not the wise approach to try to replicate every policy section of Whitehall inside my department. So we have people who are very capable, who normally come from the department whose policy they are dealing with, and they both coordinate and deal with the department.
Okay, and you said that the department's likely to exist for around 2.5 years. So, are there any plans if suddenly transitional arrangements are needed, and it could be 3 or 4 years down the line? Are there any arrangements for monitoring progress after we've left and the deals are done? Because there will be ongoing work in, say, some of the trade negotiations.
Yeah,
so, is 2.5 years long enough?
Well, we'll see when we get closer. I mean, one of the things I hope the committee realises we have to focus and prioritise what we're doing. At the moment, we're prioritising the policy work, the engagement. What they call the engagement work is a word I hate, but it means getting out and talking to the industries and the universities and all the other involved sectors, civil society, as well as our diplomatic interlocutors. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment. And the pattern of requirement over the course of that 2.5 years will change. So from now until shortly after March, it's massively predominantly policy driven. From March onwards, there'll still be policy action because we may need to switch some approaches. And then when we get towards the end of that period, we'll have a good idea well before then whether we need to extend anything. But generally speaking, I don't think we're expecting a major demand for the department thereafter. But as I say, we'll make those decisions close to the time.
Okay, and obviously we were
Hearing bit.
So we were very impressed, obviously, when we visited the department, and there's some excellent.
Hearing bit.
So we were very impressed, obviously, when we visited the department, and there's some excellent and senior, experienced people there. But there was some concern that a large number of the team are quite experienced from Whitehall's perspective in terms of being process driven, rather than looking at the individual areas of expertise, such as with the devolved administration, such as with trade, with things like some of the concerns that universities have. There wasn't that sort of experience coming through. Is that how are you going to tap and deal with some of those gaps?
Well, two different ways. I mean, firstly, you're right. Although they do tend to come from departments that have that exposure. Secondly, we have been, a vast quantity, probably I've got the numbers here, vast quantity of engagement activities with various stakeholders who themselves, I say to all of them, put in papers, analyse your problem for us so we understand it, quantify it, give us what your solutions are, tell us what you're worried about with respect to our policy proposals. We do all of that. And we're also taking on some outsiders. I mean, you're quite right. The cleverest civil servant in the world may take some time to get up to speed, I don't know, on insurance passporting or just-in-time manufacturing systems or customs systems, those sorts of things. And so we do look for a bit of grey hair outside, but we're doing that more gradually. We can take some time over that component of it. With respect to the devolved administrations, we have put in place a committee called JMCEN. I apologise for the acronym, Joint Ministerial Committee European Negotiations is what it stands for. And as a part of that, there's been a fairly sizable set of bilateral meetings between our civil servants in Whitehall and the civil servants in each of the devolved administrations. Something we take very, very seriously indeed. The first place I went to visit on appointment virtually was Northern Ireland, and then Ireland after that. I've been to Scotland, I've been to Wales, to make those contacts. But that's the other thing we're doing there. And that, if anything, is getting stronger over time.
Okay, and just because I was looking at the boards that have been established by the department, and I understand there's about 7 boards, 3 of which are predominantly looking at the process of leaving the EU. There was just one around markets, one around justice and security, one around trade, and one around EU funding. Do you think the focus of the department is enough about sectors of the country that are going to be affected either positively or negatively by leaving the EU? Or do you think the focus of the department is still on the process of the actual exiting?
Well, let me go back to that, the analysis I was talking about before, that we started the 57 industrial and service sectors. As I say, they cover 85% of the economy. The bits that are not in the 85% are things like imputed rent, public service sections and so on, in value-added terms. We will, as we go through, do two things. Firstly, at the first cut, what we're already doing is, as I just said, talking to Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales about the specific areas of interest for them. So, for example, the employment levels in agriculture in the country is something like 1.5%, something of that order. Northern Ireland's more like 9%. You know. In Wales has its own perspective. I mean, we've seen stuff on steel, for example, imported from Wales. Scotland has its own financial services sector of very significant size, you know, and of course fisheries is important to some of the nations. So that's the first cut, and then beyond that, we haven't got to this stage yet. We'll also look at the regional effect as well. The idea of this aim is to get the best outcome for the country as a whole, but to make sure that everybody gains from it.
Okay, and do you feel, my final question, being so London-based is a disadvantage to the department?
Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, the first speech I gave to CBI was in Cardiff. One of my first visits was to Glasgow after I went to Belfast.
But the actual department itself.
Well, the department, remember, is primarily coordinating. It's not doing all of the work itself, and that's one of the reasons why the JMC was set up, to not just have a political exchange, but also to cause an exchange to take place at the official level. It's very difficult if you've got a department doing a hard job, and this is a hard job. I don't minimise the size of the job. A department doing a hard job to split it up around the place. You've got to do something in coordinating in one place, and so we're conscious of the need to represent everywhere in the UK. Ministers in particular have been around everywhere from Blackburn to Bristol to Belfast and on, and we'll continue doing that. As I say, we haven't done enough yet on the regional engagement, to use my department's phrase, but that will come.
Thank you. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, you've said you want to be, quite rightly, prepared on all fronts for the negotiations. What importance is being given to the relationships and good relationships that will be needed, not just with the negotiators themselves, but with each of our 27 member states, with whom we hope to have good and expanding relations in the future?
Well, we give a great deal of importance to it. We are slightly constrained by the Commission's sensitivities on no negotiation before notification, right? And the member states want to obey that constraint. But nevertheless, I've been able to talk to Ireland, Spain, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland, ministers, that is, and then ambassadors beyond that, and there'll be others off the top of my head. I can't remember them all. The Prime Minister's been to see most of the leaders of the various 27 states, and it is an important part of the negotiation. Crispin Blunt got into trouble in a debate last week for quoting Moltke about no plan survives contact with, and he used the word the enemy, and everybody got very cross about that, quite rightly. But the simple truth is, the plan will be the plan when we start. It'll be modified by the interests of the various other countries and our building interests and alliances. Remember, our approach to the negotiation is on the premise, on two or three premises. Number one, what somebody's called the mercantilist premise, and it's not mercantilist, but basically the economic premise that other people have common interests with us. Trade is a good thing. You know, we have an net 67 billion trade deficit with the European Union, so they have an interest in all of that. But it's not just that. Also beyond that, we have every intention of continuing to be a good European citizen. So the fact we're leaving the European Union doesn't mean we're going to stop taking an interest in European security, European military defence and so on. We have 4 battalions, I think, in Estonia and Poland, if not now, very shortly. We make huge contributions to counter-terrorism in Europe. So all of these interests will be engaged too. So we are on that process, and I rather suspect that in the 6 months, into the first 6 months of next year, I'm going to get, actually not an awful lot of travel miles, but I'm going to get a lot of miles under my belt, getting around them all.
Is there a coordinated plan within the government and the cabinet for ensuring that all these relationships are being built up at the moment?
Yes, that's going on as we stand, yeah.
Thank you. Could I turn to the question of non-tariff barriers, which seem to be a greater concern possibly than tariffs? How important a part of your negotiating objectives is it to ensure that non-tariff barriers do not reappear in the way that we saw that we have seen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, the one of the reasons we've left the aim, the strategic aim, at the level of generality it is in economic terms, is because we recognise that non-tariff barriers are probably a bigger issue than tariff barriers in the long run, and partly because we do actually have a surplus in services, and services is where they hit most. So we're putting a lot of effort into understanding and grounding things like the non-tariff barriers in financial services, but also professional services. And I say a lot of effort into grounding because you've got a very, very wide range of views about how important these is. It's quite easy to work out the impact of a 10% or a 70% tariff, whatever it might be. It's much harder to work out the impact of the removal, let's say, of a passport scheme or something like that, because of course there are sometimes ways around it. So, but we're doing all of that, and that's probably taking a disproportionate, if there is such a thing, a disproportionate amount of the effort of the department, a larger than average. That's a better way of putting it.
One thing that UK citizens and indeed European citizens have grown very used to in the past few years is very easily available and relatively cheap air transport. I was at Stansted Airport on Sunday on the way to Berlin, and it was heaving with both British and European citizens wanting to travel. One thing the British certainly did not vote for was a reduction in the ability to do that in a convenient way. I wonder whether the Open Skies Agreement and negotiations on that are at the top of negotiating objectives.
Well, they're up in the first division. The top might be putting it, I mean, there's a whole series of which are sort of equal first. And the Transport Secretary is very seized of this. I've had meetings with him. I've actually had a round table with the industry myself, as well as the ones he has had with the industry and my junior ministers there. And we think we're in a good position, to be honest. I mean, Britain is a very, very major. You talk about Berlin, but Britain itself is a very major destination. British Airlines are important, as are others, of course, who operate out here. But so we have a fair degree of, I won't say negotiating leverage is the wrong word, but it's in other people's interests to maintain this as well as us. So we're very keen on that. It's not just at a national level. If you are the mayor of a town in one of the Mediterranean states that benefits from EasyJet or one of the other low-cost airlines, you've got an interest too. So there's all sorts of bits of leverage. But we're well across that anyway. The answer is to your question.
Just finally, Chairman,
yes, sure.
last week there was the welcome and common sense decision about the European Patent Office, which would be a benefit to British business. Has the department given thought to such important institutions as the European Medicines Agency, given that the UK has a very large pharmaceutical industry, which is absolutely vital to our economy?
Yeah, the answer is yes on both counts. Two points, however. Let me separate our point. You didn't ask the question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. On the Patent Office, one of the things, of course, that falls under my department is the continuing relationship with the European Union, the General Affairs Council, and so on. And we have taken the very firm view that we continue to be good European citizens and support these measures for the last couple of years, as well as seeking to maintain relationships afterwards. On the European Medicines Agency, we have had a lot of conversations. I mean, I had AstraZeneca in just this week. I was in Cambridge last week as well. And we are still getting clear from the industry what their preferred outcome is. There are some slight differences in terms of outcome, but again, it's one of our high priority areas.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested just to follow on from the Chairman's earlier questions to Mr Davis about the transitional arrangements. You were asked last week in the Chamber by Wayne David, will the Government consider making any contribution in any shape or form for access to the single market? And you said the major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market, and if that is included in what you're talking about, then of course we will consider it. I assumed that that was a transitional arrangement that we were talking about there. Was I correct in that assumption, or is it something that could go beyond the transitional period?
Look, first thing to say, Mr Carmichael, is that at this stage, 3 months short of the start of the negotiation, I'm going to hold every option open that I can. I'm not going to shut something off unnecessarily. So to not count it out is also not to count it in. It was slightly overinterpreted, but what I'm trying to do is to keep open as many negotiating tools as I can, and that's one of them.
So you would be telling us today then that you would envisage that sort of arrangement of paying for access to the single market being something that could be an indefinite arrangement?
I'm not, as I said, I'm not ruling it in either, and therefore I'm not envisaging it. That's the simplest way of putting it. When we get closer to the coalface, that's the wrong word. When we get closer to the negotiation, I may well come back and talk to you about that. I may need to do that in closed session.
So how would this work then? Describe the arrangement that you're actually speaking about here.
Well, I'm not talking about an arrangement. I'm not ruling something out. Full stop. I'm not ruling it in either.
So what were you talking about last week then?
What he said was, will we make every effort to keep this market open? And I said yes. That's all. No more than that.
Right. And the consequences of not getting that, if it comes to it?
The consequences
of not getting that, if that's what were to happen?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, one of the issues here, which is, it's not the first time I've faced it in this House, is that we have a negotiation coming up, and I have done as much as I can at this point to make plain what our negotiating aims are. I'll remind you, get control over immigration, get control over our laws, get the best possible deal from British companies in manufacturing and services across the board, cooperation on law enforcement and counter-terrorism cooperation. Now, the reason we haven't specified them in more detail than that is there are many ways of achieving those outcomes. It's like, this is much more complicated than a chess game, but what I'll be able to tell you is what the opening of the chess game is. I won't be able to tell you the mid-game and the end game, or the outcome, and it's not a game, the outcome, until we're well into the negotiation, because it will depend to some extent on the very point that Mr Lefroy raised, the attitudes and approaches of other members, the 27 other members, as well as the Commission itself. So to try to say, oh, will you do this, or will you do that, will you do that, will just shut off options which would actually limit our ability. It comes right to the point that I was making earlier, that I will not do things which undermine our ability to negotiate.
So, just so we're not misrepresenting you here then, last week you were talking about something that might be a transitional or might be a permanent arrangement that might involve or might not involve the payment for access to the single market in the future. That's clear.
Many years ago, Mr Chairman, your father gave me some very strong advice. He said, don't let anybody else put words into your mouth.
Well, To move on then, just to explore also a bit further the question of your arrangements for consulting the devolved administrations.
Sure.
You've described the joint ministerial committee that's been set up.
Yep.
You've been touring the country. That is at this early preliminary stage where you are effectively preparing your case, you're gathering your evidence. What's going to be the involvement of the devolved administrations when it comes to the actual negotiation?
Well, they will have, the purpose of JMCEN is to get the input from all of the all the devolved administrations onto what their view of the policy aim should be. So, for example, at the next JMC in January, I think Mike Ruskell is presenting to us the Scottish Government's views on what that should be. And the aim is to absorb that into the joint negotiating brief, make a decision on it will help inform the decision on what the aim should be. That's the primary role. That's the primary.
If you have conflicting aims then between the different devolved administrations, how do you resolve that?
There may be. We'll need to debate them at the JMCEN and make a decision. That's exactly what will happen. And of course, there may well be conflicting aims. Because I was answering the dispatch box in the debate this week, I was unable to chair the JMC, which I would normally do. But there were debates on Justice and Home Affairs there, and also on immigration. I have not yet read the transcript of the debate that took place, or the note from it, but I would be surprised if there wasn't different views on some elements of immigration, for example, around the table. And there will be others, and we'll have to resolve them as best we can in the overall national interest.
Mm-hmm. And where you have a sector, you mentioned a number, financial services, and I think you included fisheries in the list there.
Yes, well.
How do you accommodate the wishes of the devolved administration where they have, as you have in Scotland in the fisheries sector, a dominant interest?
Well, we haven't got to that point yet, but we will, as far as we can, accommodate all of them. But as I say, if they're not in conflict with each other, that's the main issue here. You can't give one part of the country a veto over the outcome, but you can do everything possible to make sure they get the best outcome. I mean, if I may sort of switch from Scotland for a second, I mean, one of the very high priorities was the issue in Northern Ireland of the border and maintaining that. And I've made very plain that that's a high priority. Nobody on JMCEN has argued against that at all. So, some areas are going to have a degree of unanimity, and others we'll have to debate the matter out. I can't predict how the debate will turn out for you, sir.
Okay, on a similar but different topic, there is a question of the government of Gibraltar, who have made known their concerns. What engagement have you had with the government of Gibraltar?
The Chief Minister came to see me some time ago, and my junior ministers have been in touch on several occasions. The issue with Gibraltar, the primary issue with Gibraltar, not the only issue, but the primary issue with Gibraltar is sovereignty, and the argument with Spain over sovereignty. And we have made it very plain we will always respect the wishes of the people of Gibraltar. I used to be a Gibraltar minister. It's written into my blood.
Okay, couldn't be clearer.
Thank you very much indeed. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State, for coming before us this afternoon. In response to a question from Alistair Carmichael there, you reeled off a list of outcomes that you're looking for. I was going to ask you, what are the key strategic objectives you've set for yourself in the Article 50 negotiations?
Well, they were really. Respecting the requests of the referendum, the instruction of the people in the referendum, which means bringing back control, which includes laws and borders, money, and then beyond that, seeking the best national interest outcome for in terms of trade and the best security outcome, justice, home affairs, and security outcome. In the latter case, as close as we can get to the current operational results, not necessarily the current organisation.
Now, you've given us a spectrum of options on the customs union. In relation to the single market, if I may turn to that in particular, you've been reported on various occasions as saying that you think we should stay in the single market. Now, I heard what you said earlier about reports of what you've said and what you haven't said, but can you tell us now, have you reached a view as to whether we should stay in the single market or not?
No, I mean, this is one of those things where we have to work out what's compatible. And our view at the moment is to keep that general purpose option, that strategic aim, open at the moment, full stop, just open, and not come to a conclusion until we've done more work on it.
Are you looking at a range of options on the single market? I mean, the Prime Minister has said it's not a binary choice. Others may disagree with that, but are you looking at a range of options?
She said that about customs union, not about single market, I think. Although we have to, this is one of those things where we have to see what develops on the continent as well. One of the difficulties, Ms. Cherry, as you'll appreciate probably as much as me, is that we are at an early stage of negotiation where the stance is a very firm one, shall we say, very strong one, and so it's really quite hard to read how it will develop beyond here. But that's part of the analysis. But broadly speaking, we're sticking to the overarching aim: maximum possible access, services, goods, networks, and so on.
You'll be aware from the JMC that the devolved nations have all said that they want access to the single market. How do you intend to preserve that for the devolved nations?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing here is to distinguish. I remember, I think she raised this point in the Chamber, didn't you, last week. You were excessively flattering about me at the time. The thing to bear in mind is people often conflate access and membership, and what matters really is access. What matters is the ability to sell our goods and services in the continent of Europe, and for European manufacturers and providers to be able to sell their goods and services here. And that's the main thing. I'm a big believer in free trade, and that's what we're after.
Now, Mr Carmichael has asked you about this business of paying into the EU budget in exchange for access to the single market. Can I ask you, have you put any limit on the level of payments you would be prepared to consider?
As I said to him, leaving something open is not saying you're going to do it. I also have to say this. I mean, it's by way of aside. I've been asked in the Chamber on a number of occasions, would you pay whatever it was, 47 billion? Would you pay this? Would you pay that? I can think of little more useful to the other side in this negotiation than for me to answer questions like that. But as I said, we're keeping something open. Doesn't mean we're doing it.
Now, just turning to the subject of the border between the north and the south of Ireland, on a visit to Belfast in September, you wrote, I think, in the Belfast Telegraph that there wouldn't be any return to a hard border. Is that still your view?
Yes, very much so.
And can you explain what you mean by a hard border?
Well, one with a fence, one with checkpoints, all those sorts of things. I mean, the aim here, a very important part of the peace agreement was the removal of any visible border and so on. It doesn't mean there can't be different tax regimes north and south. It doesn't mean there can't be checks on things that are said north and south in other ways. But it's a very important symbolic part of that peace agreement. I have to say, by the way, just as an aside on this, I'm optimistic that the European Union will be helpful to us in this. Mr. Barnier, Michel Barnier, who's an old sparring partner of mine, is also very seized of this. When I saw him, we didn't talk about the negotiations, but he did raise, as ab initio, out of nowhere, his involvement in it and his commitment to it. And so it gave me a degree of comfort, shall we say, that we should be able to do this in some way.
You said there a hard border involved, to avoid having a hard border you would have no fence and no checkpoints. Can you explain to us how a common travel area could continue to work within these islands if the Republic of Ireland's in the European Union and the North of Ireland isn't?
Firstly, in terms of legalistic issues, in the Amsterdam Treaty, which I negotiated, the common travel area is actually a clause of that treaty. Now, it's not quite perfect because it talks in terms of different members of the Union rather than one in, one out, but it's all recognised in there. Secondly, people say, well, wouldn't Ireland be a route into Britain? Well, really, there are 50 million people land at British airports every year. It's a very long-winded way to get into the United Kingdom, to come via Dublin. If you want to come in, you come as a tourist and you stay. That's what happens as if people are trying to come in illegally in some way. I also don't foresee a circumstance where we're going to stop tourists at all. We're going to have lots of people coming in and out of Britain. So I don't see it as big an issue as being as that question implies. The other thing I'd say is this, that I also went to Dublin. They were equally keen to maintain this, and we may well have discussions with them at some point about their own incoming security, so that we know what. So we've got some at least watch list type thing there, but that's for them to decide, not me.
What migration controls do you envisage for the United Kingdom after Brexit happens?
Well, first thing to say is that my job is to bring the decision back to the UK. It's for the Home Office to run the migration control. So it's really a question you should put to the Home Secretary. The main point I would put here, because people sort of jump to the conclusion, well, we're going to shut the borders, we're going to shut up shop, is that I would expect any future government of whatever colour to run our control of borders in the national interest, which means that, as I think the Chancellor's already said, allowing the movement of talent, movement of people, running things so the economy works well. So in those terms, that's how I see it working.
Thank you very much. Now, last week the committee was in Sunderland, and we took evidence from local politicians and business people there and trade unionists. And I asked all of them, and not one of them was aware of the terms of the deal that's been reached with Nissan. The Office of Budget Responsibility don't know, and nor do the European Commission. Now, you're the only person this committee's seen so far who's in a position to tell us what sort of a deal Nissan got. Will you take that opportunity this afternoon?
Well, actually, somebody better than me is doing it in front of the Biz Committee right now, namely the Biz Secretary of State. He knows this inside out. I know the broad outlines. But what I can tell you is there was no undertaking that was mooted at the time to match tariff matching, because that's illegal. Well, it's not under the WTO rules. But beyond that, I do recommend you take that with Biz.
Are you not in a position to tell us just now what's been told to the business committee?
I can tell you no more than's in the public domain. That's exactly what I know.
But you're saying that evidence has been given by another government Secretary of State this afternoon?
To the Biz Committee at the moment.
Which is more detailed than what you've been able to tell us just now?
Well, I'm assuming so, but I'm assuming that's why he's there.
Is it possible, Secretary of State, to conceive of a settlement for Gibraltar or Northern Ireland that does not differentiate in its terms in some way in relation to the rest of the deal for the UK?
Can you restate the question? I'm not quite sure I understood it.
Well, we've talked about Northern Ireland particularly. We've talked about Northern Ireland with your desire not to have a hard border, and Mr Carmichael has raised some of the concerns of the government of Gibraltar. My question to you is it possible to conceive of a settlement that doesn't differentiate in some way in relation to the particular cases of Gibraltar and Northern Ireland, for them to have a slightly different deal from the rest of the United Kingdom because of their particular circumstances?
I would be loath to go down that route. I think it's very important for the people of Northern Ireland to see themselves as a part of the United Kingdom until they choose otherwise. And similarly, the Gibraltarians see themselves in those terms. They expressed it very forcibly in a referendum, not the one on European Union, but on the one on their own sovereignty some years ago. In 90-something%, it was a positively Soviet result. So I don't think it would be a good idea to go down that route. We are looking at all options that we can conceive of that should look to have any practical application. And so we're not ruling anything out. Again, I'm sorry to say I'm not ruling anything out again, use that phrase. But we're looking at all options, and the more difficult the problem, the more options we'll look at. But at the moment, I don't see one that meets what you've described.
Okay. Thank you.
Just on that last point, could you just confirm that Gibraltar already has a differentiated status?
It has, well,
because it's not part of the customs union.
as does yes, and as in other ways, as does places like the Isle of Man and Jersey. So
Right.
there are distinctions. Yeah.
Right. Now that's very helpful indeed. Thank you, John Whittingdale.
Thank you. Can I return to first of all, to the resources question? We understand, following our visit to the department a few weeks ago, that the staff of UPREP in Brussels are now reporting to you. However, they are also continuing to conduct normal EU business whilst we're members of the EU, and for that, the Foreign Office is the sort of lead department.
For that, sorry, no.
The Foreign Office is the lead department. Is that correct, and is that working all right, and where are the reporting lines?
That's not quite the right distinction. The distinction is that where they're maintaining bilateral relationships with other countries around Europe, then the Foreign Office is the lead department. Where it's dealing with the General Affairs Council, the continuing day-to-day business with the European Union, that's our lead. David Jones represents the government on the General Affairs Council.
Okay. And to what extent are you taking advantage of our embassies across other member states? Are you going to use those resources to undertake bilateral discussions with individual member states? And are the staff of those embassies reporting to you or to the Foreign Office?
The Foreign Office direct, but on these issues, it's not an issue that is a problem in any way, Mr. Whittingdale. I mean, for example, on Friday and Saturday, I was in Madrid and Seville, seeing, as near as there is one, my opposite numbers. I saw the Deputy Prime Minister, who's got responsibility for Brexit, and I saw the very new Foreign Secretary, Mr. Dastis, and the ambassador accompanied me to those meetings, provided the prior briefing, incredibly high quality prior briefing, I might add, and also gave me his readout of the way he thought meetings had gone. And so now that service, as it were, is one for which the British Foreign Service has a tremendous history and tremendous capability, and so there's no clash in that division of accountability.
Okay. Can I ask you, in your discussions with individual member states, is it your impression that generally they see this as the UK ship of state sailing away from the convoy, whilst the rest continue to proceed at the same speed and in the same direction, as if nothing else has happened?
Look, I mean, it varies. It differs between countries. Most of the ones I've seen so far have volunteered to see me, rather than the other way around particularly. And they do that because most of them regret our departure. I think it's fair to say, and I shouldn't conceal the fact, they wish we were staying. Right? And the reason they wish we were staying is because we have been a spokesman for a certain mindset inside the European Union. More decentralised, very free trading, responsible on budgeting and finance, and so on. So they're sorry to see us go, but so how they see the grand ship of the European state, as it were, if that's the right phrase for it, to continue, I don't really know. I think that's a debate they're going to have amongst themselves. It's as much influenced, I think, by their perspective of the way global politics is going, as it is by us. I mean, by the Tusk, the Trump result, the Renzi referendum, and the issue there, and that worries them a bit, I think. But in mostly, it's sort of friendly regret is the sort of emotion I see, really.
I understand that they would like us to still be at the table pressing for reform, given we're not going to be any longer.
And they understand that.
Yeah. But do they see the process of these negotiations simply as reaching a deal for the UK with the European Union, or would some perhaps see this as an opportunity to raise the kinds of issues that are going to be discussed in the negotiation, but actually more generally for reform of the whole European Union?
I haven't seen that. All I can say is I haven't seen it. I better not sort of try and read their minds, but that hasn't come up and I haven't seen that. What I would observe is that the Union has a number of issues to deal with, whether the migration issues, terrorism issues, or the domestic states anyway, and obviously the financial stability issue. And frankly, I think that dominates their thought process, as well as their own at-home domestic economic issues. That dominates their thought process more than the grand direction of the Union. That's my impression, but it is only an impression. I can't say I sort of try to analyse that.
Have you detected any recognition that the UK voted to leave, and we are the only country that has really given its people that opportunity so far, but there are indications that other countries in the European Union, should they hold referendums, might produce the same result?
Well, that is an issue which worries the Commission more than the nation states, I think. One of the issues I have to deal with is that the nation states, quite properly, put the interests of their own people high up their priority list, and that's helpful to us because free trade is one of the things that's mutually beneficial. The Commission is obviously concerned about the risk of somebody else following suit and so on, and that has manifested itself in a slightly not aggressive is the wrong word, in a view that maybe we can't be allowed to do too well out of this. That's reducing a bit, frankly, over time, but it's still there, but it's more a function of the institutions than of the member states.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter Lilly.
Thank you. What is the minimum scope of issues which have to be covered in the withdrawal negotiations if either side wanted to keep it to a bare minimum?
I think I pretty much defined that, but in a way, if you ask me the simplest scope rather than the minimum scope, it will be free access, free trade, free access for goods and services from our point of view, and hopefully the security issue. But that's pretty much what our ask is in a way, or will be when we get there.
I'm surprised by I thought they saw the minimum scope as being the divorce settlement.
Oh, I said to me. I'm sorry, misunderstood.
Who keeps the house and who pays the mortgage?
Sorry, this is the minimum deal that they will strike, or something like that, or the A50 process.
If one wants to keep the negotiation short and sweet,
Yeah.
What would be the minimum issues that have to be covered by it? A, from their perspective, and B, from our perspective.
Well, this brings you to the interpretation of Article 50 itself, which I'm always getting the word slightly wrong, but in essence say the arrangements for departure, but also having regard to the ongoing relationship. So I take the view that it's the whole thing really. But we're going to have to discuss this. This is something where there's various views stated, and I'm going to need to talk to Michel Barnier at some length about this at some point.
I want to come back to that business about taking account of the future framework, but once Article 50 is triggered, how are the negotiations likely to be sequenced?
Well, that's something we haven't yet organised. That is something which we're going to need at some point very early on to discuss how we organise the whole negotiation process, beginning to end, including whether we leave time for ratification, the thing that Mr. Barnier raised last week. But we haven't engaged at that point yet. When we do, we'll no doubt need to think about the practicalities. How do you get through the things you get through in the time available?
Something which will influence that sequencing is the bit of Article 50 which you mentioned, which says the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. Now, have you or will you seek legal advice on this? It seems to me that that means you cannot negotiate unless you know, in outline at least, what the framework for its future relationship with the Union will be. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't that be helpful for us if we could say, let's decide what the framework is going to be. Is it going to be broadly free trade and no new barriers, or do you want to go to trading on World Trade Organization terms? But until we know which of those two frameworks it is, we can't really negotiate anything else according to the treaty.
Yeah. I mean, I'm loath to take your encouragement to take legal advice. It hasn't been wholly successful, the legal advice we've had so far. Let me.
I'll offer you legal advice.
I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you. The simple approach to this will be, I think, to talk to Michel Barnier about the practicalities of it. And you're making a good point, Mr. Lilly, but I think this is not something going to be settled in court. It's got to be something that's amicably talked about. And I have every belief that he wants to get a practical outcome of this as much as I do. I mean, I know Michel of old. I mean, I've known him for 20 years, and he'll be a tough negotiator, but he will want the best outcome. The aim of this, for all of us, is the best outcome for the United Kingdom and the best outcome for the European Union. And I am entirely persuaded if we maintain that, we negotiate in good faith, we're clear about what we're trying to do, we will get a good outcome. And I don't think that we'll have a serious problem with that. But it does require us to talk to him first.
I believe my colleague wants to share a bit of my time, if that's permitted, Chairman.
Not at this stage, no.
Not at this stage, but I will try and bring others in when I've gone through. That is really helpful, Peter. Stephen Timms.
Secretary of State, you told the Chairman earlier that you couldn't at this stage confirm that the Brexit negotiation plan will be a white paper. Presumably it might be a white paper. I mean, that's still a possibility.
I just don't know, Mr. Twigg. The decision, I mean, in my sort of mind, the decision is work out what content I can put into it and then decide what the right format is. And I don't want to mislead you on that. It's very important to me. I mean, you all know my history of Parliament. It's very important to me that I deal properly with you and I don't mislead you. So it's content first, format second.
No, I understand that. So it's possible that it could be a white paper. I mean, if it wasn't, if it turned out not to be a white paper, what status would you envisage that it would have?
Well, I don't know yet. I just think the public at large, I mean, I haven't worried about this, I haven't spent time worrying about this, frankly, because I think the public at large care about the content, not the format. They care about what we say, where we're going, not how it's formatted, not whether it's a command paper or whatever. I just haven't thought about it yet.
Right. Would you envisage that once it's been published, it will be consulted upon over a period, the 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is?
In what context?
Well, would there be a public consultation?
Well, there'll be a debate about it, I should think. Bear in mind we're aiming to trigger by March 31st, earlier if we can. And bear in mind that we have to amass the content, and some of the research is not complete yet, and the policy decisions, a number of policy decisions are not complete yet. I mean, we're going to have, because so much of this is done in parallel, you get quite a lot of policy decisions coming quite late on, together, and some of them interact on each other. So it will take us a little time to get to that point.
And so the point you're making is that would constrain the ability.
Constrain the amount of time. We'll allow as much time as we can, but it will be dictated by the outcomes. I won't have much choice in what we do.
So you'll allow as much time as you can for consultation, but it probably wouldn't necessarily be the full period. You made the point a moment ago that it's very important that the UK should be clear in its negotiating objectives. Do you accept the view that having a clear and full statement of UK objectives endorsed by Parliament will strengthen ministers' hands in the negotiations that follow?
To be honest, it's it's not a major component of the discussion. What I think will take over, as I've said to a couple of our colleagues, your colleagues already, is that at the end of the day it will be the collective interest of the European Union, United Kingdom, that will be the predominant driver of the negotiation. This is not going to be a sort of single-dimensional haggling match. It won't be like that, which is why I've tried to characterise it in terms of the mutual interest and mutual benefit to both.
But wouldn't it strengthen ministers' hands to have a document setting out objectives which Parliament has endorsed?
I can see where you're going, Mr. Twigg, and you're not going to draw me.
Okay. All right, well, can I press you a little bit further on the content you envisage for the plan? I mean, we've had a discussion already this afternoon about how many options there are for our future relationship with the customs union. Would you envisage that the plan will set out the option which the government wishes for the
My
UK?
expectation is yes. We'll say as clearly as we can where we want to go. In the event that there's more than one option, we might put more than one option up. But I would expect us to characterise what we want to do. Yeah.
What about something like whether the European Medicines Agency should stay in the UK or not? Would you envisage that sort of level of detail?
That's quite a lot of detail. It's quite a long way down the detail. I wouldn't have thought it would be that detailed, but again, as I say, it depends on. You're asking me to make judgments about outcomes we haven't arrived at. So I wouldn't have thought that level of detail, but I don't know.
Right. I mean, presumably the plan will set out the UK government's objectives, recognising they may not all be achieved, but a clear statement of the objectives will be included there. Just how long a document do you think this is going to be?
That's determined by the content. I mean, my test will be what can I put in the public domain without jeopardising the negotiating brief. That's it. And as much as I can, I'll put in under that criterion. And at this stage, I don't know what that'll be.
Right. I mean, one could, I suppose, envisage a document that might be a couple of sides, or one could envisage a document that would be 30 or 40 pages. I mean, you're able to indicate sort of
You're asking me to make judgments on what I don't know, so I don't know.
Depends on the size of the typeface.
Yeah.
There speaks the Times journalist.
Yeah.
Larger typeface to fill the page.
Are you able to?
But no big pictures. That's right.
Are you able to tell us? I mean, I've asked about the customs union. Sort of more detailed thing about the European Medicines Agency. Are you able to tell us any other sort of points of content that you would expect to be in the plan?
Not at this stage. I mean, as I say, it's content first, and that decision requires us to know what the policy aims are in detail. We know them in broad outline now, but what the policy aims are in detail, and then to say, will releasing that information be hazardous or not? And if it's not hazardous, then we'll release it.
Thank you.
Jonathan Edwards.
Chairman. Can we just turn to the major piece of legislation you'll be bringing forward in the
Great Repeal Bill?
The Great Repeal Bill, the so-called Great Repeal Bill. Can you commit today that this committee will have sufficient time to scrutinise it in pre-legislation terms?
Oh, no, I can't. I mean, what I'm of a mind on that, to come back to this, is to try and give Parliament some advance side of what we're trying to do. But we have a timetable that's an issue, timetable issue here. If it's in the Queen's speech for the next session, we will need to get that out of the way, get it done. And the reason I say that is because consequential upon it. I mean, bear in mind what it's going to do. It's pretty straightforward in its aims. It'll take the acquis communautaire and put them pretty much, not quite, but pretty much untouched into British law, but then after that there will be consequential legislation. Now some of it will be primary legislation, and therefore we'll need time to go through before the conclusion of the negotiation, or before the ratification of the negotiation anyway. And that will take some time, so we need to leave time for There's also, there'll be some secondary legislation to go through. That I would expect quite technical, not contentious at all, but it will still require time. And there's a fair amount of it. Because, look, we've been in the Union for, 40-something years. We've got a lot of law, many thousands of pages of statute, which depend on it. And much of it is coined in ways which relate to European institutions or European guidances which will no longer be there. So we'll have to do that as well. Some of that, as I say, very technical, will take time. So we have to make sure we've got the time to do that. I don't think, and I'm actually, Mr. Chairman, I'll say that I'm happy to come back and speak about the Great Repeal Bill at some length on another occasion, if that's helpful to the committee.
I'm sure it will be.
Yeah, but we will be on a time constraint on this, which will be tight.
And do you think there's sufficient time to bring forward the bill and the consequential legislation before Brexit Day 1?
Yes, I think so. I think so.
And in terms of so you're envisaging basically, is it going to be a comprehensive bill which then outlines what's going to be removed, or just bringing it down?
No, it's going to be I think it's going to be, we're still drafting, but we think it's going to be a simple bill. But then with the major parts of change, I don't know. I mean, it's a reasonable assumption that we'll have to do something about, I don't know, agricultural fisheries that was raised earlier. One of those may well need a bill to go with it. There'll be other elements too, maybe on migration, somebody was raising earlier as well, I don't know. But that's I'm guessing at this point. But that's a reasonable guess, and we've got to leave time for that.
So the consequential legislation will be the no more interesting part, perhaps, where the big
debates may
happen.
It might well be.
And if the UK government was to decide to remove aspects of EU law from domestic law, would that be done by primary legislation then, or SI, or are you ruling out using Henry VIII?
If it's material, it'd be primary. If it's material, it'd be primary. As I say, if it's technical amendments to, you no longer can put something in the European Journal, you've got to put it on the British government website, say, then that's something I'd expect to be SI. Whereas a major policy decision would be a primary legislation.
That's good news. What about, you won't use Henry VIII powers at all?
Say again?
You don't envisage using...
Well, Henry VIII powers is a vague term. I mean, the SIs, I suppose by definition, are sort of Henry VIII powers, but they'll be technical mostly. I don't foresee major changes on SI.
I'm sure you followed the discussion in the Supreme Court, in particular the evidence put forward by the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government in terms of the Sewell Convention in particular. And there was a very interesting debate around the terms not normal, i.e. the UK Government would not normally legislate in devolved competencies. Can you define what not normal means in the work that you will be doing as Secretary of State over the next few years?
Oh, not off the top of my head. No, there are sort of two elements here which I think are being argued about. One is whether or not the devolved administrations should have a veto over the whole sort of outcome. And we've argued very, very high levels of consultation and involvement, but no veto. But the other side of the coin is what happens to powers that return, and I expect that to be a major debate to get the right outcome. I'm as some of your colleagues may know, I'm fairly pro-devolution, but we've got to make it work. We've got to make it work with the UK single market, we've got to make it work for Wales, and so on.
Potentially, by the time we get to this debate, all three devolved governments would have a reserve powers model. So based on that, technically, if major policy fields were being returned from Brussels, for instance, agriculture, fisheries, they should be going automatically to...
Well, it'll be a matter of debate. I mean, it'll be a matter of some debate. I mean, my preference is for devolution where at all possible. But you've got to do things. You may have to, given that the international negotiation is a reserve power, you have to maintain the ability to do that international negotiation. Given you've got a UK single market, you have to do things to maintain a UK single market. It's very important to Wales, very important to Scotland, very important to Northern Ireland, although the Irish market's also very important there. And you have to do that. You have to take measure to look after that too. So it's not quite universal, but I take it where you're coming from. I'm listening to where you're coming from there.
And a final question, Chair.
Sure.
If there are disputes around where those powers should lie, how are they going to be resolved? Is that the JMC process, or...?
Well, in final analysis, it's the British government will decide, but it'll be a JMC process in the first instance.
Okay, thank you. Emma Reynolds.
Chair, thank you, Secretary of State, for coming before the committee. You recently described these negotiations before a House of Lords committee back in September as maybe the most complicated negotiation of all time. Can I take from that that you believe that a so-called quickie divorce, which would take 6 months, would be unfeasible?
Well, without I always get into trouble when I use metaphors. You may remember the "Get thee behind me, Satan" line as well, which got me into trouble, which by misinterpretation. So let me be specific. I take the view that the best outcome is a negotiated free access to markets outcome, and with it, a negotiated outcome on justice, home affairs and security. I don't think they can be done in 6 months, I thought.
Okay, thank you. You appeared very confident in the answers you gave the Chair on this specific point, that we could wrap all of that up in the 2 years on Article 50. But isn't it the case that the Council will be giving guidelines to Monsieur Barnier, Michel Barnier, on the basis of Article 50, and actually EU free trade agreements with third countries up until now have been based on Article 218 of the treaty, and it may well be the case, even if the Council concedes that these are parallel negotiations, that they won't be done in the manner that you suggested?
We haven't, it's a good question, we haven't resolved with the Council how they're going to do that. You're right that our expectation is that there will be guidance given, both at the beginning and ongoing, but that decision, as far as I'm aware, has not yet been taken. Maybe taken maybe take tomorrow, actually, or in the near future. So that's the first thing. The legal basis is one of the things actually we're looking at ourselves at the moment. The legal basis of the outcome has become a very important issue after Wallonia and the CET and so on. And so one of my discussions with Michel Barnier must be about how we get, what the timetable of the end game or the end outcome. I hate the word end game. The end outcome will be, and that's one of my early discussions with him.
Indeed, CETA, although it was an ambitious free trade agreement, is one that we wouldn't want to emulate, I would suggest, because it doesn't cover financial services and it doesn't cover some of the other areas that we would be interested in. It did take 7 years, and it was deemed to be a mixed agreement, and therefore subject to ratification of 38 member state parliaments and regional parliaments that is yet to be
as I said, that's the Walloon problem. There is one very big difference to bear in mind with this, and it sort of plays back into the Great Repeal Bill as well. Most of these free trade agreements, particularly with the European Union, most of them in any part of the world, a large part of the negotiating phase is negotiating over the whole question of common standards. And on the last day of our membership of the European Union, we have identical foreign standards, identical product standards and service standards and so on to the European Union. We have perfect mutual recognition for most areas. So that bit is sort of instant result, takes a slice out of it. The second component...
Sorry, can I just interject on that though? Because obviously the rub will be that these regulations and standards will be developed in the future, and the Swiss have an arrangement whereby they have to have they have to have an arbitration of developing standards in the future.
That's right, and we have to do and you're quite right, and indeed the CETA treaty has exactly such an arbitration arrangement in place. Now, but the other, just finish my original point.
Sorry.
That's all right. It's a very important debate. This. The other element of most international agreements is there's an entry into force period, and very often the entry into force period is a harmonisation period when things come into effect, and in neither case will we have those problems. So that's why I think this can be done in 2 years. That's why I think, because you're taking out those elements. And it's one of the reasons for the original design of the strategy with the Great Repeal Bill, which could almost equally be called the Great Continuity Bill. You know.
Great Incorporation Bill.
Yes, if you like. That's not so, that doesn't quite have the same appeal. You know?
Sure, it didn't do what was needed at your conference, but we've had a range of witnesses representing different parts of industry. Obviously, we've had the CBI as well, and we've asked a number of questions about WTO rules and tariffs. And every witness that we've had that represents different businesses and industries have said that they wouldn't want to fall back on WTO rules and tariffs in March 2019 once we leave. And you have said repeatedly this afternoon, and indeed in the Chamber, that you want maximum access to the single market. Can I take it from that both in the plan that you present to Parliament and the letter that will trigger Article 50, that you will explicitly set out that your overall objective is to avoid that scenario, to avoid a WTO scenario in March 2019?
Well, I won't say it in those terms. I'll state it in terms. Well, firstly, in terms of the letter, we haven't. There's never been one of these letters before, so how it's phrased may be important in terms of the relationship between the Council and the Commission, and the amount of freedom the Commission has and so on. So there are various aspects of that which I'm still thinking about in terms of whether we phrase a long or a short letter. Right? So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say about this is that we'll state it in terms of objectives, not things to avoid. I mean, we're not going to this negotiation as supplicants. We're going as equal partners, and that's how we're going to conduct ourselves. This is going to be done in a way which we hopefully everybody will treat each other with the best of intentions and the best of aims.
But is the government's objective to have better access to the rest of the European market than simply WTO access? Would that be a safe?
The government's objective is to have as close to the level of access that we currently have as we can achieve.
Okay, and in terms of the letter, do you feel that you have a good understanding of what the other side expects from that letter? Because as you say, this hasn't been done before, and if we get ourselves into a situation where the other side expects a lot more detail and the government presents something very non-detailed, then that could set things off badly.
I have an idea what they expect, but forgive me if I don't detail that anymore.
My last question is that the Prime Minister recently visited India to talk about a future trade agreement with the Indian government, and it was interesting that the Indian government didn't want to just talk about trade, they wanted to talk about visas for business people and international students. You said in the House of Commons recently that you keep the option open, we had that exchange with Mr Carmichael, of possibly paying in. Is it also the case that, given that we want as close as possible maximum access to the EU single market, that although we would take back control of immigration, that we could still end up with a preferential system for EU migrants rather than non-EU migrants? A preferential system for EU migrants over non-EU migrants?
I think take back control is quite an important issue here. I mean, the example I'll point you to is the Swiss example, who thought they had control of their own migration via an emergency brake situation, which when they tried to exercise it, they were unable to, because it was tied into so many other treaties. So I think what we have to bear in mind is we have to pay respect to the outcome of the referendum, and therefore it's got to be clear control by this Parliament.
I understand that, but may there be a differentiation between low-skilled immigration and high-skilled immigration?
Well, again, my job is to bring the decision back here, not to exercise the decision thereafter.
And you don't think that will be part of the negotiation?
No, I don't. I think that the operation of that decision after we have left the European Union will be in the national interest, and that will affect all levels of skill. The judgment that the government comes to as to what's necessary for universities, what's necessary for business, and what's necessary for fruit picking.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I just follow up one point on arbitration arrangements? Because a number of the possibilities that you've outlined in your evidence this afternoon, Mr Davis, could well involve some arbitration arrangements thereafter to sort out where there are differences of interpretation. The government would be prepared to accept such arbitration arrangements as part of a deal?
Almost any free trade arrangement, which I guess is one option, almost any free trade arrangement has an arbitration arrangement of some sort.
And that would involve the UK having to abide by the outcome of the arbitration?
Depends on how it's written. I mean, well, for example, if the arbitration says that the one party has not met this standard or something like that, then it may mean that they can no longer export a certain good. That's hardly onerous.
But that would mean us subjecting ourselves to the decision of a higher body.
It may.
Now, can you just explain?
Well, we do anyway. We do. Look,
well, I agree.
We're members of the Council of Europe. We subject ourselves to the ECHR. We're members of a number of bodies where we subject ourselves.
And I'm just trying to understand what is the difference in principle between accepting those higher authorities in those examples you've just given and accepting the higher authority of the European Court of Justice?
Because one relates just to trade and the other relates to intrusions in laws that operate within this country.
And that is what you think the distinction is?
That's major.
But if it prevented us from, an arbitration decision prevented us from exporting goods, well, it would impact upon this country.
Well, when you export goods, if you did, let's say, to the United States, you'll be subject to the operation of the courts of the United States for meeting their standards. That's nothing unusual about that. I mean, the idea that you deal with somebody on a commercial basis means that you accept their standards for selling them goods or services, and that's fair enough.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Secretary of State. It's been a pleasure to listen to a pro at work during the afternoon, so thank you very much.
Should I take that as a compliment?
You certainly should. You certainly should. It's a sticky wicket you're on, and it is definitely a compliment. Could I start by just asking a question about tone of negotiations, because there's something you said that I think would be very helpful. You made the point that at the end of the day, whatever it is that we would like to set out by way of objectives, the negotiation will come down to mutual benefit between the two. Could you confirm that that is really the case? Because we have an awful lot of public comment in this country which seems to suggest it's all about us at the end of the day. We're a big trading nation, the fifth largest economy. Sooner or later, when push comes to shove in negotiations, the trade issues will dominate everything else. And actually, that isn't the reality, as I understood you said that.
Of course it isn't. I mean, for many of the nations of Europe, Europe represents something much bigger than trade. It represents democracy. Represents the rule of law. I mean, look at all of the countries that came out of the Soviet Empire. For them, this is not just about trade. Trade is important, but it's not just about trade. I was acutely conscious when I was a Europe minister back when you were still at school, sir.
I think I was in another part of the government.
I know you were. I'm just teasing you. I'm getting my revenge. And you would have attended some of those councils too.
I did.
We were different in some ways from the others. This is not a claim of benefit or greatness. It's just that they had a view of this institution they were part of, which was more than that. And this isn't why I say that what we want to have is a successful EU and a successful UK. And it isn't why I define that in terms greater than economic, in terms of security and mutual values, and protection of mutual values and so on. It's that I say those things because I believe them, but it is an important part of the argument. It is an important part of the argument.
I agree with that. I think it's very helpful that the Secretary of State states it in such a way. In that case, in relation to something you said in answer to John, could I just probe slightly when you said you thought it was more the EU that was worried about issues of contagion and cohesion necessarily than nation states? In my conversations with colleagues recently over the past few months, politicians representing national states in different parties, they've expressed that their countries are as concerned about cohesion as probably the European Commission was.
Cohesion is a word with two very different meanings.
What was your evidence suggesting that it's the EU that's worried about this as opposed to nation states?
Well, they're public statements. The public statements is only really the institutions talk publicly about Britain not being able to do better out of this, and that's what drives that. It's not malice. It's not in any sense any enmity. It's because they fear that if we come out very well, then other countries will be tempted to emulate us. So I don't. I don't blame them for that fear. I just think it's misplaced. I think that they're wrong about it. Some other countries do take a similar view. I mean, probably. I haven't actually spoken to a German minister yet, but I would think Germany may take a view like that. It's possible, and it may well be France does as well. And I've spoken to Michel, but I haven't spoken to a French minister on it yet. But broadly speaking, it's an institutional. It's more predominant amongst institutions than amongst the nation states. That's probably a better way of saying it.
Okay. The practical outcome of this is that that's a factor in the negotiations as well.
Of course.
Okay. Could I just probe just a couple of other things, if I may? You made a reference earlier to that. When negotiations have reached further and we have the issue about how you can keep Parliament up to date with negotiations as they get more detailed, you mentioned something about closed session. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Is it your intention to come back to colleagues in a closed session at different stages with some very meaty
maybe
stuff?
I don't know at this stage. I mentioned it as a possibility. I don't know at this stage what happens, as you'll remember, Mr. Burt, in these negotiations is information is often sensitive for a few days or a week or two, but not for months or years. The other thing is that sometimes, and we'll try, as it were, not to sort of hold information too long after the point at which it's no longer sensitive, and not at all longer if possible. And very occasionally it may be that one wants to say, look, this is how it looks, this is the position of the various countries. Somehow I wouldn't want to be in the public domain at all. But that's the sort of circumstance under which we might have a closed session.
Okay, thank you. My last question is just to say, do you find it helpful as you come to the point of detailed negotiations and discussions with colleagues in Europe that a quite large group of MPs persist in tweaking the tail of the EU by writing letters to them, signed by lots of them, with some challenge or other? Is this helpful to you? Is this harmful to you? Or is this, although annoying, really of no consequence?
Yeah, you started off by calling me a pro. I've got far too much sense of self-preservation to answer that question.
I'm not going to press you.
Right, well, that is duly noted. Carl McCarthy.
Chairman, Secretary of State, I'm going to take you right back to the start, unfortunately, of this session, because that's the way we work. I'm going to refer
it has a sort of certain cyclic feel to it.
Here we go. But hopefully short and sweet. Maria Caulfield asked you about staffing in your department. When we visited, we were told that 307 staff at that point had been appointed, and some of us were shocked and a little dismayed to find that all had come from the civil service. Because we've all seen Yes Minister, and as I pointed out, they've had 2 centuries worth of honing their procrastination skills. And if anything we want to happen in the next 2 years in your team, if it's to achieve good for you and the country, is that we need good people not to take anything into the long grass. So my question to you is, and it's maybe a bit of a Top Gun analogy, you want the best of the best. So of the new 23 people, as you said, there's now 330, have any of those people not been from the civil service? Are any of them brought from outside? Just let me finish. Are brought from the outside with outside expertise? Because do you not agree that actually you've probably got enough ice men and ice women and you probably need some mavericks?
I'm going to resist the you dragging me into the they've got enough mavericks already in the political wing. The simple answer to your question is, if I were able instantly to snap up 100 people who are well qualified from outside, have perfect fits for them, I'd do it. But we're in a real world. We've got to get on with the job, and that's what we're doing at the moment. And it's a hell of a pace for job. A lot of the source of the analytical work comes from outside, from the businesses we're talking to and so on. In terms of pace, this department is a little different from the Yes Minister time, because they're all volunteers. every single one of the new groups coming from the 40 onwards are volunteers. We have vast numbers of volunteers for a small number of jobs, and they want to make it work. And that's why I don't think we're going to see procrastination. I certainly haven't seen any so far.
I'm very pleased to hear that you've got every confidence in them, but I would just point out that they may all be volunteers, but they're all on secondment, so there is no performance enhancement for them. If it all goes wrong, they'll be going back to their old jobs. I'll repeat to you, do you not think you need some outside expertise, people who aren't from the civil service?
We're gradually bringing in some, but the reason they're volunteers is because this department is at the pivot of a historic change in our country, and they want a part of that. And I'll tease civil servants along with as well as the next one. Remember, I used to be a PAC chairman. I'm fairly familiar with the syndrome. But these people want the best for their country, and as do I, as do everybody in this room, I'm sure. And they will do their best for their country.
Okay, Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary of State. Can I ask you a little more about immigration, Secretary of State? Net immigration to the UK currently runs at something over 300,000 a year, split roughly 50-50 between EU immigration and non-EU immigration, slightly more from outside the EU. It's not too far from 50-50. The immigration policy is going to change as a result of us leaving the European Union. What is the policy objective of the change that we will make? Is it still to reduce net immigration to tens of thousands rather than the 300,000 plus that it is at the moment?
All I can do for you, bear in mind I said earlier, Mr McFadden, that my task is to bring the decision home, as it were, and for others to exercise the decision. But I draw your attention, I think, to comments both by the Prime Minister and by the current Home Secretary, who have said that that aim is still there, but they've also warned, it's not going to be sudden, it's not going to happen overnight, there's not going to be a sudden closing of doors and so on. And my own view of this, as I said earlier, is that it will be exercised in the national interest, which does not mean suddenly denying universities Nobel laureates coming there, or denying businesses the ability to transfer managers from Tokyo or Berlin or wherever. And it doesn't involve shutting down all the fruit picking farms in the country either. So.
But is it a reasonable expectation on behalf of the public that the policy outcome of taking back control of immigration is for them to see it reduced to less than a third of its current levels? Is that what
third?
the public,
Which third of what?
A third of its current levels of net immigration of 300,000 plus a year. Is that
I think it's a reasonable expectation, but over time.
Thank you.
Right, Michael Gove.
What assessment have you made of the aims of the EU 27 and what do you think Commissioner Barnier's criteria will be for success in the negotiations?
For
success.
Success. It's very hard to know the last. He's not quite concluded his tour of 27 he's doing himself. When he gets to the end of that, he'll come back. He will have a view which I think will be laid down by. He'll make a presentation to the Council, and then they will lay down the negotiating guidelines. And I think that's what he's going to have to take as his guidance, as his aim, and his criterion for success. And I'll make just this point as an aside to that. Michel got quite heavily criticised by the British press when he was appointed. I think a bit unfairly, to be honest. When he was the Commissioner for the City, effectively, for financial services, he was very tough at the beginning. But the judgment I come across in the City was he was pretty pragmatic in the conclusion. That is my memory of him from the past. So you didn't actually ask that, but that's that. In terms of 27, they vary. They vary, and there's a point that nobody's asked, but which I think is important to make in this context, and that is, from the beginning of this process, there were 17 electoral events between the beginning and the probable conclusion. From now, since we've had the Italian referendum and the Austrian election, there are still 15 to go, my best estimate, assuming we go the distance. So in a way, the water is changing. It's flowing past and altering, and so the aims may be different. The second thing to say is the different parts of the Union tend to fall into different categories. The so-called Visegráds have views which place security and migration high up the batting order. The Swedes, very pro-free trade, and in fact all the Nordics very pro-free trade. The Spaniards, similarly pro-free trade. Quite a lot of them, I mean, some of it is driven by the strength of the links with us. So when I was in Madrid, the ambassador had lunch for me with people, all businessmen, all of whom had strong links. So it's not a single entity. It is, I'm just giving examples here, but it's not a single entity. But at the end of the day, I think we are going to have to harness two things. One is self-interest, economic self-interest, and maybe security self-interest. And the other is a persuasion of them that it's actually in Europe's best interest to have a friend and a strong trading partner off the northwestern shore.
You've stressed the diversity of interests across the European Union.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that Britain is one of only 2 European Union countries capable of projecting significant force abroad, and therefore when it comes to protecting the eastern border of the European Union and of NATO, for example, only really Britain and France can protect Baltic states and Poland, and therefore it would be in their interest to ensure that Britain remained a strong defence partner?
Yes, I think that's right. That's accurate.
Having stressed the diversity of interests across the European Union, do you think it conceivable that a country like Spain, faced with pressure from the Catalans and the Basque country for separate arrangements within Spain, that a country like Spain would want to see differential treatment for different parts of the United Kingdom?
Probably not.
Given the diversity of opinion that there is across the European Union, the case has sometimes been made that the Commission will want to punish Britain in order to show that leaving the European Union has consequences. And indeed, Donald Tusk, speaking on behalf of the Council, said there'll be no cake on the table, only salt and vinegar. What's the worst they could do if they decided that they wanted to go for, I don't know, what you could call the walkers?
Mr. Gove, I'm not going to put ideas in anybody's head in that respect. Let me just say to you, you're sort of looking for sort of one-word answers along the way, and sometimes I don't want to give them. Firstly, I mean, much of this is at this stage, right? I mean, even your comment about Spain, it's at this stage. Maybe they may change their minds. I don't know. But there is a viewpoint, I think, which is only really just fading among some Europeans, that we can't really mean this, right? That we could be persuaded to change our minds. Maybe that's what Mr. Tusk was trying to do. I don't know. I can't read his mind. But as recently as October, at least one head of government was saying, "How are you going to change it? How are you going to reverse this? How are you going to reverse this?" And many of the others still feel it can't really happen. So that's partly the sort of mindset that's still the end of is there now. As we get further into this, once we've served the Article 50 letter, one of the virtues of the Article 50 process is it sets you on way. You know, it's very, very difficult to see it being revoked. We don't intend to revoke it. It may not be revocable. I don't know. But so that's the route we're going down. And I expect, at least at that point, people's calculation will change from how can we make them change their minds to how do we best deal with this.
It's very, very helpful. I'm anxious because I'm going to bring proceedings to a close at 4 and we have to go and vote, and there were...
Of course, one last question.
Very, very quickly. And a succinct...
Is it within the remit of the British government to think about, for example, reducing corporation tax, changing VAT, or changing the regulatory tools that are within its control in order to make Britain an even more attractive destination for investment if the European Commission and the Council seem intent on trying to punish us?
Can you explain that in more detail?
Well, I'm not sure I do want to explain, because in fairness...
The simple point is, we're invited to believe that the European Union can put the screws on us. Of course, the truth is that if they do so, they're harming themselves more than they harm us, and we have many tools which can make our country a far more attractive destination for investment than they can make their countries attractive destinations for investment. So the assumption which underlies much commentary around this, which is that we're weak and they're strong, is in fact a misreading of the situation.
You make a good point, but I'm not a natural mercantilist.
I was going to observe that tax policy is probably above your pay grade, Dominic grade. Rob.
I'll take your advice, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Secretary of State, you used an interesting formulation early on about Britain remaining a European citizen outside the EU. And when we talk about the dry grey details, and also about what we don't want because we don't want to show our hand, there is a risk, a perception risk within government, in Parliament, that we sound rather miserly. And I just wonder whether you shared my high-level ambition that it is perfectly possible, subject to the negotiation, which is a two-way process, that Britain can be an even better neighbour, ally, trading partner outside of the political fetters of the EU. And I just wonder whether at the highest level that is and ought to be the government's ambition.
Yes, I more than share it. That is my view. I mean, that is the aim. This is, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a turning point in our history in which we are going to have lots of opportunities to seize, which will give Britain a better future, in my view. And with a stronger economic future, we can be a better economic, security, cultural, diplomatic neighbour. And so, yes, it's more than just my view, it is part of the aim.
Okay. Thank you. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. We had a very interesting discussion earlier about facts and opinions in the debate on around
I'm tempted
Brexit.
to quote the past governor of the Bank of England, who said if I was interesting it was a mistake.
I just wanted to ask a couple of very quick questions. Yeah. You've talked about the best outcome for Britain. My interpretation from what you've said is that would largely be around what's best for the British economy and our security. Would that be fair? Those
are two high-level aims which are material to the interests of every British citizen. They all want to have jobs, they all want to be better off, and they all want to have a secure life. So they are. But they're not the only aims. I mean, Mr. Raab, just speaking now, actually made a rather good point about the sort of the position we hold in the world, if you like, is also quite important.
Well, I was also having some meetings with businesses, and I was struck by the feedback that from a range of organisations who felt that there hadn't been a structured consultation with businesses in different sectors. I'm not sure if you would feel that you would agree with that. It would be interesting to know how you've been reaching out and how you've been communicating the findings from any of your discussions, and indeed whether or not the findings and will be reflected in the white paper or whatever colour your document might be when that's published. And just as part of this conversation, I was very interested. The feedback I had was that they didn't feel that you and your department had fully understood the implications of losing the financial services passport and didn't understand your position on that at the moment.
Sorry, say that last sentence again.
Weren't aware of your position on the financial services passport and whether they felt that you'd had understood from their point of view the implications of losing that, and indeed their concerns around equivalence rules with the instability that would bring, in that they could be much more subject to withdrawal for regulatory change reasons or political reasons.
Right, okay. Well, firstly, in terms of the understanding of passports, I mean, passports is a complex subject, but it's not an incomprehensible subject by a long margin. And there are about 9 different categories, and in aggregate, they affect more than half a dozen areas of finance, but they're not an area where necessarily we are in disadvantage. I mean, for example, something like 5,500 British companies seek passports in the European Union. 8,000 union companies seek passports here. So there is a quid pro quo in this. There's a playback. In terms of our conversations with companies, of course, this is a whole of government operation. It's not simply DEXU, to use a horrible acronym. I mean, our ministers alone have seen 130 companies from every sector of the economy since July. Every other department virtually of government has been seeing their own client group, if that's the right phrase. We've had vast numbers of round tables. I can send you a list if you like of those. Now, of course, we can't get around to see every company. What we are doing is understanding the detailed approach and the detailed problem in each area. And my approach to that is fairly straightforward. I say to them, first give me the insight on what the problem is, and I'm not me, my department does. First give us the insight on what the problem is, quantify it, give us an indication of how much we're talking about in terms of employment, costs, capital, let me just finish the point, and also what your policy answers are and what you want our policy answers to be. And yes, some of it becomes complex. You're talking about mutual equivalence under MiFID, under CRD, under Insolvency 2. There are a whole series of areas where we are working on solutions for them, and we understand only too clearly some of those mutual equivalence things being, in their view, unstable because of the ability to have regulatory change on their feet.
I know we won't be
that's
able,
what we're trying to solve.
I understand we won't be able to take this further, but I just will reiterate that the feedback was that the consultation hasn't been structured, and they haven't felt that there has been much communication, and so I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
But in terms of the feedback,
I'll be very happy to hear from you in terms of areas where you think that's happened, and we will go back to it again. But I can tell you, in terms, it's been a vast effort. I mean, in terms of my experience in government, one of the biggest efforts ever. It's done very quickly. It had to be done quickly because we had to get on with this. But and of course the conclusion hasn't come out yet. That's the point. We're halfway through the process. Okay.
Finally, Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Wilson.
For obvious reasons, you've quite often today used the phrase that you're not ruling anything out. There's one issue I would like to hear you rule out today. And you mentioned that you wanted to see no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. That's something which we share. But can you rule out that will not be delivered via having the border controls between the island of Ireland and Great Britain?
I don't know, Mr. Wilson, at the moment. Let me. My view here is I don't see that will be the solution, to be honest. But what I don't want to do, the primary concern for me, the reason I'm hesitating, is the primary concern for me is to make sure that we don't have that hard border. All right, and there are various technical ways of resolving that. We haven't finished that process. We're doing it in consultation with the Irish government, or we're making progress with the Irish government. We may not have a solution to it in the next few months. What I will undertake to do is to write to you on that matter once we've had a further think on the matter. I can see the issue, absolutely see the issue, and I can see that's a very second best solution. I think we can find a better one, but I won't make a promise today, but I'll make a point of writing to you when we've got further down the road of the solution.
Okay. Just two very quick final questions from me. First of all, will the Great Repeal Bill be published in draft to allow for pre-legislative scrutiny?
I said earlier to Mr. Edwards, I don't think we may not be able to hit that timetable. But again, I'll write you, Chairman, on that, if I may.
And secondly, I invited you in the debate last week on the question of whether Parliament will have a vote on the final deal when it has been negotiated, to move from the words that you have been using to look Parliament, and you've got an opportunity to look the committee in the eye today and answer a simple yes. Would you like to take the chance to do so?
What I'll say to you is, as I said in Parliament, there's a constitutional reform and governance bill which covers this, and we will obey the law to the letter.
So can I take that to be a yes then?
I'm going to return to you, Mr. Chairman, with your father's own words. Don't let anybody else put your words in your mouth.
Well, thank you very much for coming to give evidence this afternoon. Order.